Welcome to Macaulay Heritage Park, one of our 5 county museums. We are very reliant on volunteers across the museum system, but at this site in particular. And you are in for a treat today as you will be toured around the site by 2 of our most experienced volunteers, Nancy and Don. So I'll throw it to them now.
My name's Don Metcalf. I've been a guide here at Macaulay House for the last 18 years or so. I enjoy it very much, and we're looking due west with the sun shining on this beautiful home that in 8 years will be 200 years old. It was built in 1830. So let's go inside and we'll take a look at some of the other rooms inside the house. A house of this nature at this time period was known as cradle to grave. You were born in the house, you died in the house. So you had to be literally taken out in your coffin at the end of your time on this earth or at the end of your demise. So this is why we have this nice big heavy door. Okay, now I'm going to take a look down the hallway. You'll notice that this is a Georgian home. It's a center hall plan, a gorgeous staircase going up, very short risers, wide treads, very comfortable stairway to use, mainly for guests, because the guests always use the front of the house. If you were a servant, you would have to use the back staircase entrance that goes from the top down into the kitchen. One of the main features of the parlor is this Italianate marble fireplace. It's a gorgeously carved fireplace and original to the house. And one of the other things that they've done when they've taken the background of this house, they've taken it to the 1850s. So around that time, you'll notice that there's quite an ornate insert in the fireplace. This is for coal, because they are now starting to burn coal inside their homes instead of just wood. It produces a greater amount of heat and with less work and less energy to prepare it. I'll point out a few of the other items inside the home. This piano represents a gift for the first Mrs. Macaulay, because Macaulay was married twice, from her parents in England. So it was shipped all the way from England across, probably to Montreal, down the St. Lawrence, or barged, however, and probably picked up in Kingston and horse and buggy down to Prince Edward County. So it's quite a beautiful old piece of furniture. The photo in this living room is of John Franklin, Captain John Franklin, who was with the Franklin expedition in the Arctic. His boat that sunk was recently raised up at the Arctic by the Canadian Coast Guard and government. All the men on that boat perished. 2 reasons: A, they drowned, and B, if they got off the boat, they didn't survive because they were not used to such severe weather in the Arctic. A lot of them perished. There was even a hint at maybe some form of cannibalism among the crew. A member on that voyage was Charlotte Levis-Conte's brother, Henry Levis-Conte, who also perished. Henry Levis-Conte's sister is buried here in the graveyard over by the church with her husband, Reverend Macaulay. The most prized possession, as far as the furnishing goes, is this table in the corner. It is cherry inlaid with mahogany. Because this table is made from exotic wood, it was probably either made in the United States or offshore. Now you can understand why we use such a large door to get into the home. This secretary that's part of the living room is a huge piece of furnishing, more than likely walnut. And at one time, Picton had about 5 or 6 furniture companies. Well, what happened? Why aren't there any more? Well, it's one of those things that everybody's now going to IKEA to buy their homemade quick furniture. No one wants to spend time, money, and effort on a large piece of furniture such as this. Welcome to the dining room. I call this is my pet name for this dining room, the Charlotte Levis-Conte room. I think as the daughter of a sea captain and the sister of a sea officer, she was probably used to lavish entertainment. You can see the way the table is set. It's very geometric. There's a pattern to it. You set something in the center, and then gradually as you go to the end of the table, everything is balanced so that you have not just 1, but 2 candelabras. Again, the furnishings are probably walnut. This is called Greek Revival furniture. And the uniqueness of the chairs is that it's woven horsehair that wears like iron. Everything in this room is to the period. So yes, these chairs are about 160, 170 years old, and not a scratch or a rip in them. The silverware is bone, not plastic. One of the very unique dishes on the sideboard is this one. And I always ask guests when they look at it, I said, what shape is this? What do you think they served in something like this? And they would guess and say, oh, probably a sandwich or maybe some kind of form of meat or so on. But one of my responses to their guesses is, well, you know, if you parachute into Prince Edward County, you're never more than 5 or 10 minutes away from water. We have a huge coastline around the county and many interior lakes. So they're going to serve a lot of fish. Even today, when we have weddings, brides and grooms will want to stand out here and get their picture taken. It's gorgeous. There is the Reverend Macaulay. That's the one and only picture we have of the gentleman whose area this was named after. And in the corner we have a prie-dieu. And this is where Macaulay would go on bended knee and say his morning prayers in his own quiet corner. So this door would be an entranceway into the pantry, so food could be brought in, set down, kept warm, and then served on the table. We are upstairs. We are in the servants' quarters. So as I look at the floor, I notice how uneven everything is. There are various widths of boards and so on. In other words, they weren't terribly particular with the furnishings and the woodwork for a young servant girl. So this girl would be 11, 12 years old. She took on a lot of responsibility. The responsibility of looking after a senior person in the home. And she would have to be on that woman's beck and call. The other thing, it gave her a chance to develop her own social life. Because by the time, within 3 or 4 years, when she's 15, she's going to be married. An anxious moment to get married because she doesn't want to be considered an old maid. You'll notice that it's a tick, a feather tick, suspended on ropes. And in some cases, if you couldn't afford a feather tick, you were stuffed the mattress with boughs of cedar or spruce or whatever, and often became infested with insects. You'll look at the furnishings in this room, the contrast at what we saw in the dining room and the parlor, and a few very basic clothes, a nightgown, a nightcap, and at least a place to wash her hands. We are now in the child's room. Reverend Macaulay, with his second wife, Charlotte Levisconte, had 2 girls. You can see that, like all the other rooms, even in the child's room, we have a fireplace because there is no central heating in a home of this size. Every room is heated individually through the use of a fire. You'll see the games are very simple. They have very simple toys that a young girl or a young child would have today, for example, dolls and so on. The only thing that's missing out of this room is there's nothing here made of plastic. Everything's either wood or plaster or china. The glass covered windows so the child can see all the work and all the toys in the room. Clothing set out for a young lady, dress, faux fur jacket and coat. And of course, having her own individual bed. This is definitely a room of privilege because she has her own bedroom. It's not as though she's like a lot of children in log cabins and so on were stuck up on a loft where 5 or 6 children were sleeping together in one area. Welcome to the guest room. The guest room is only used for those members who are close to the family or somebody of a religious position, maybe the bishop of the church, who would come to visit Reverend Macaulay. So this was a very special room for that reason. I like it. Again, it's one of my favorite rooms because, again, we have a very elaborate coal insert. This happened to be made in Kingston, Ontario. The furnishings are wonderful. The bedstead is amazing because when you look at the intricacy of the post of the bed, this is done on a pedal-driven lathe. So this requires an awful lot of expertise and patience because you have to control the rotation of the lathe with just the pressure of your foot on the treadle. The quilt is the Philip Plume quilt. It's actually, in this room, one of our oldest artifacts. It dates back to almost 150 to 160 years old. We are now in the master bedroom, and you'll notice as I walk over here, people who visit the house always say, well, the bed is rather small. Well, maybe yes and maybe no, depending, I guess, on who's sleeping in it. But there's one thing of the 19th century is people slept differently. As you and I sleep today, propped up in bed with a pillow or a bolster behind us while we're reading. And then when we finish reading, we want to go to sleep, we put the book down and lie out horizontally. Here, that's the way they slept. They slept with their backs bolstered and a pillow at their head, and that was the way they slept. An interesting item in here, this is a blanket chest, so the top lifts up, and you store all the blankets on top, inside. This is the ablutions room. I suppose today we'd call it the ensuite. This is where they kept themselves clean and washed. Now, granted, they didn't take a bath, they didn't have the everyday shower, and if you're a teenage girl, you're probably not washing your hair every night either. So the maid or the woman of the house would have to come upstairs, bring some warm water, and bring it to the bathtub. There was an order in which the family received their bath. The father of the house would get the first one, his wife the second, the oldest boy, oldest girl would get the third, and so on all down the line. So hence we have that expression today, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. So this water was used, it was warm, and it was reused by the entire family. Literally a Saturday night bath would, even at that time, would have been a luxury. People are a little stunned that you could actually have a bath in something like this, but by sitting down or standing up, it seemed to work. Again, a fireplace in this room to keep it warm and cozy. We have a modern commode for toilet. You just pop off the lid and use it. Another interesting facet of this room is the closet. There weren't a lot of closets in the second floors of homes in Upper Canada. It's a luxury in some ways because you had another area for storage for clothing. The reason a lot of people didn't have closets in their homes was because there weren't a lot of clothes. They didn't wear a lot. We are now in Reverend Macaulay's study. This is probably where he would do a lot of his church business, the finances of the church. Perhaps he would also use it to counsel young couples who are about to become married, or maybe even use it as a form of counseling for a widower or widower who lost their spouse. And we get the most beautiful view out the back window, into the gardens, into the apple trees, and all these are original cultivars of apples that are in this orchard. The books in the corner of the shelf, mostly religious books, critiques on various books of the Bible, that type of thing, because it is Reverend Macaulay's study, and because he was a man of the cloth, most of the books would pertain to religion. There's something different about this fireplace. It's wood, but it looks like marble. And I'm going to butcher some French, but the marble is called trompe l'œil, which means fool the eye. And there'd be somebody around, an itinerant artisan who would come to your house and say, you've got a wooden fireplace, I can make it look like marble. And sure enough, he would bring out his paints and paint out various shades of gray and make various patterns on the shelf to make it look like it's a little more than it really was.
Okay, you have found your way to the Macaulay Hearth Kitchen. I'm Nancy. I have been volunteering at the museum for a long time, and one of the things I really enjoy doing is cooking over the open hearth. We have a number of cast iron pots and pans that we use regularly that would have been the same things that they used in the day. And cast iron has become very popular again, so when we have visitors, it's terrific to talk with people about how they're using their cast iron pots in their modern kitchens. We have a griddle upon which we do Welsh cakes and scones. A lot easier than heating up our bake oven. Something that we use with school children quite often. And one of the things about our lovely Rumford fireplace is the fact that you can work close to it without fear. Our smoke and heat from the fire goes straight up the chimney. And so children are really comfortable doing soups and stews and working with the griddle And the baking pots have a indentation in the lid so that you can put your fire underneath, and then once you've got your baking in, you put it on the top, and it is a very efficient oven. Anytime you're doing soups and stews, you'll find that you're working with domed lids. And the purpose of that is so that the moisture from the soups and stews continues to drip back down into the pot. The bake oven we still are able to use. It takes about 2 hours to heat. You build the fire right inside. When I throw flour on the brick and it flames, then I know that it's hot enough to put the bread in, which is the thing that takes the greatest heat and takes the longest to cook. And we put the ashes into this chute where you see the bricks, and that keeps any cold air from coming up into the fireplace so that we don't prematurely cause the oven to drop in temperature. Beside that, we have what they call a dry cupboard. And in the day, it was necessary to keep your gunpowder and your sugar and your flour, etc., in an area where it could stay dry. We have a lovely pantry set up. The dishes that you see in that pantry would have been in the butler's pantry, which was a change in the time of the second marriage and part of the restoration of the dining room. The pantry is also a workroom, because there are times when you need to be away from the smoke of the fire. You also need to be away from drafts. And so when you were whipping your eggs and your cream and various things like that, being able to tuck into the pantry was very helpful. The water came from the gutters, and it was stored, and then you were able to pump that water up into the dry sink. Underneath here, there is no plumbing. You would have to have a fairly large bucket so that when you pulled your plug and your water drained away, you were putting it into a bucket. And they would have probably used that water again as well. Each of these shapes is for a different purpose. So this type of jug would have liquids in it. So it could be anything from stout or your hop lemonade to vinegars of various kinds, because it has a small top. Some of the larger ones might have been used for purees. In order to keep the air from getting into these vessels, they often used the intestines of a pig. Part of the purpose of that is that it was thin, but it was something that you could stretch over the mouth of a jar, and as it dried, then you would seal the air into it. And you'll often see that on top of that piece of intestine, they will have put a piece of cloth, muslin or whatever, just to tie it off to keep it clean while it's being stored. We have a dough box, which is situated near the fire so that it would get warmth. You would put your yeast or sourdoughs in here to proof, and would be able to flip the lid over to do your kneading down, put it back in for your second rise, and then forming. So it's a very functional piece of furniture. We have what we call a Welsh cupboard. There was a cupboard that the cook used and would have the things that she would need to have at hand. You will see that some of these things look fairly battered, and it would not be unusual to use in the kitchen something that had been discarded from another part of the house. So this old shaving mug could well have been used to scoop flour or batters and that sort of thing. We have a lovely tin box that inside of it has 6 small containers, each of them that have been stenciled and are ready for spices. In the day, spices were really expensive, and so the lady of the house would wear around her waist a chatelaine, which had keys for a number of things in the house, as well as her pencil and something to write on, etc. And so the spice box would be locked so that nobody was going to use the spices unless there was a need to, or nobody would steal them. Okay, one of the features that are interesting about this house is that once you pass the hearth kitchen, we start moving into what's called the longest tail in the county. The room we are in is summer kitchen, which would have been used to keep the heat and the smells of the cooking in the summertime. We talked about the beehive oven and how you heated it. And you can see the back dome here, which is 2 layers of brick and 6 inches of stand, which of course is supported on this cantilevered brick arrangement. In terms of chores, there were certainly many, all the same things that we do now, but done with slightly different arrangements. Back in the day, we were using cast irons of various shapes, sizes, and weights. And you're working with cotton and linen. You want to make sure your iron is not overly heated. And one of the ways that you helped smooth things away was by using a little dolly that had beeswax in it. And you would just rub that on the bottom of your iron, and it would help give you a start without scorching. We try to show a variety of the things that the staff would have been using in their day-to-day chores. In the main kitchen, there would be a tool similar to this, but about twice as long and twice as large, that you would use to move ash and coals around. This little one is intended to use in the stove. There were tinsmiths in the area and people who worked with cast iron. And so things like strainers and ladles would certainly be something that they would probably make a lot of. Toasting forks, and again, we all know toasting forks, and I don't think they've changed in shape or function. Many different kinds of pots made out of tin, brass buckets, more irons, and again, various and sundry tin implements that would have been used on the stove and in prepping food. They also had access through the side door here to the garden, which provided us with food for the kitchen. It was also the area where the outdoor privies for the staff would have been.
So the garden behind me is our kitchen garden. It's a pretty good sized vegetable garden. Would have been very useful in the old days for fresh vegetables at the table, and these days it's good for our food demonstrations and so on. It's also a chance to educate people, to show them what will grow in this garden. This year we're growing a lot of squash and pumpkins. Currently we have perennial plants that are very handy to have. A rhubarb is one of them. And horseradish is another one. We also have some berry bushes and herbs planted around the edge of the garden.
Back again to chores and cooking. There were all kinds of pans made out of tin, very much like the ones that we are still using today. And an interesting array of tart tins, some with flutes and some just plain. Butter was something that needed to be processed on a regular basis, and again, it was necessary to have craftspeople who were able to model things from wood and metal in order for that to take place. So we have scoops, we have paddles, which you would have moved the butter back and forth to let the whey slide through the grooves as part of the last process in butter making. And then we have blocks that are intended to do pound or half-pound blocks of butter. If you were having a fancy meal and using the fancy butter plates like they have over at the museum, you might often have a design pressed into it. In this case, a swan. And in this case, a flower. Again, beautiful churning. Talents of a good woodworker.
Well, you just saw the summer kitchen here at Macaulay House with our volunteer Nancy. And I'm now here in the stone room at the back of the house. And the stone room is a former carriage house for the Macaulays. So it's where they would have stored their carriages and sleighs. It was restored as part of a museum project around 2008 in order to allow it to become a 3-season usable space for the museums. It's now rentable, and we've used it for small weddings or teas or artisan markets as well. This room is right above the summer kitchen, and it's where the man who really helped operate the farm here at the Macaulay property would have slept. The handyman really got the short end of the stick because being above the summer kitchen meant that in the hot summer months when all of the cooking was being done at that end of the house, he was right above it, sweltering in the hot summer heat. The handyman's quarters were separate from the rest of the home and certainly not nearly as comfortable or lush as the bedrooms that the family members would have used. This was because there was definitely a differentiation between the family spaces and where the help spent their time. Here in the parlor, we see a bust of Sir Thomas Picton, the namesake for the town of Picton. Reverend William Macaulay was certainly a fan of Sir Thomas Picton, a Napoleonic War general, and he respected Picton's prowess as a military general. However, Picton, even in his time, was well known to be a cruel sort of fellow. He was governor of Trinidad in the late 1790s and was charged with excessive use of torture against a female. Because of this charge, he was sent back to the United Kingdom to face trial. And during the trial, he was convicted of this crime and sentenced to jail time. This was very unusual for the time. However, the Napoleonic Wars broke out soon after, and he was offered the chance to serve in the military and use his military prowess for good instead of going to prison. His superior, the Duke of Wellington, described Picton as dastardly a fellow as you will ever meet, but capable. Unfortunately, many men of the time only considered Picton's military exploits and his success in battle, and not his questionable personality traits and cruel nature. Reverend Macaulay always called his neighborhood Little Picton, after he'd established the parish in the late 18-teens. In 1837, when this small little village had grown up around Reverend Macaulay's parish, and another small village had grown up on what is now the north side of town called Hallowell, the two villages decided to amalgamate. At this point, Reverend Macaulay, who was a very influential member of the community, suggested that they name the new combined town Picton. A petition was sent around, but because of Reverend Macaulay's influence, the name Picton won by a landslide. And that is why almost 200 years later, our town is still named after this particular man.
Welcome to the basement, my favorite area of the house. If you take a look at the walls, you can see what they were constructed of. Prince Edward County is known for its limestone. There's huge quantities and areas of all around through the county of chunks of limestone. I won't even try to attempt to lift this. But if we look at the width of the wall here, you're looking at something that's roughly 3 feet thick. So in those days, they over-engineered the home. They made sure everything was tight and safe and wasn't going to sink. One of the most prized artisans or craftspersons during the 1800s was a man who could carve out a timber that would be used as a support beam for the basement or of a house. So to do this requires an awful lot of ability to judge measurement, to get it almost perfectly square. And gentlemen of that time or that era were really, really prized. The first area of the basement was used for food storage. To keep vegetables fresh, you have to keep the vegetables away from the air. When they oxidize, that's when they become soft, and then eventually rot sets in and you'll have to throw them out. So they devised a way of taking sand, bringing it in here, moving the sand back, and burying things like their root vegetables. It was mostly root vegetables such as carrots, potatoes, beets, that type of thing were buried under the sand. And as long as they keep the air away from them, they were fresh and they could be used daily, almost all through the winter. Good place to end up is back in the kitchen, the warmth of this great home and the families that lived here. Earlier we talked a lot about Reverend Macaulay and his family and his relationship to the town of Picton, and how we got to change the name and so on. But in my investigation of some of the people who lived here, I found the latter family, the Bond family by name, who lived here were just about as interesting. It was a fascinating family. Now, Jerry Bond was a man whom I interviewed in 2003. At that time, he was 91 years old. About 4 years later, at the age of 95, he passed away. But he was a tough man. He had 5 children, and he was one of 12 children when his father moved in. What is interesting is that Jerry's father died when he was in this house, and they had a wait for him out in the dining room, so people walked by the dining room window and paid respects to Jerry's father. Jerry married Mary Cole, so it was James Bond and Mary Cole, who raised 5 children in this home. There were 3 girls and 2 boys. The youngest girl was the last to leave, and the house was sold back to the county in 1973. What is interesting, I think, with the Bond family is that Jerry was one of these old-fashioned men who liked to be part of the community. Now, apparently, he was by trade a farmer, and he had a beautiful farm out the side here. And it was said that he didn't use any power equipment until the mid to late 1950s. Everything was done with horses and his own hands. He had a huge pair of hands. And they said he had one of the most powerful grips of any gentleman in Prince Edward County. Just to warm up, he used to shovel the driveway all the way from the barn out to the road, and that was just to keep himself in shape. That was the joke that he gave me, and I kind of chuckled at it. One of the things that the family looked forward to is the annual fair. Picton just had its annual fair this past weekend, but it was different in those days. You looked forward to the fair. You wanted to go out there. It was a time to socialize, to meet kids, to having dates and taking your girl on the Ferris wheel and doing all those other things. It was really a really exciting time for the Bond family. The house was a little different here because it would be rearranged. As a matter of fact, behind me, this room was a modern kitchen back then. And the earlier Mrs. Bond, Jerry's mother, one of the things she did was when they moved into the house, she didn't like this big gaping fireplace. So she decided to put a big, huge board against the fireplace to hide it. And in so doing, when it came to renovation of the house, when they tore that board down, they didn't realize what a beautiful fireplace they had in this kitchen. The youngest child in the family was a young girl, and when the county took over this house, it was in 1973, and up in her bedroom, which was the ablutions room we were just in a while ago, she wrote on a scrap piece of wallpaper, 1973, Eleanor Bond, God bless this house. Macaulay would have been very pleased.